Welcome to the third and final video on selections, or at least selections fundamentals in Photoshop. So we have already opened up the advanced selections.psd file. Go ahead and do that if you haven't done so. This lesson is actually going to focus more on the process of adjusting selections more than it is making selections like the previous exercises. So we're going to be taking a good look at this Refine Edge button as well as some of the other advanced options when it comes to adjusting for selections. You'll notice right away that this file, once you open it up, has two layers, a background layer and a foreground layer called Woman. So just make note of that, because for beginning Photoshop users, again, this is a big gotcha where you select the wrong layer and you continue working without realizing that the wrong layer has been selected and you're not sure why selections aren't working. So say, for example, I'm using one of my many basic selection tools like the Quick Selection tool, and I start painting without realizing that I'm on the background layer. Of course, Photoshop is not going to take into account the boundaries established up here. So we want to go ahead and select that Woman layer first. Now you can take a tool like this one, whatever you're comfortable with, but I would suggest this one, and just start selecting the background. You notice as I click and drag, I'm just adding to my selection. The goal with this selection is to eventually get the woman, the flowers, and the desk all separated from the background. So you notice the plus symbol tells me that if I click again with my left mouse button, I'm going to keep adding to the selection with this tool. So I'm just clicking and dragging to add that selection. And we're not going to get too detailed with this. It's really an exercise, so don't worry about this area here or between the flowers. This is fine. Now you'll notice what we have selected is the wall behind the woman rather than the subject, which is the woman herself. So we want to invert or flip this selection inside out. This is a common trick you can use in Photoshop to make selections. So what you want to do is you go to the Select menu at the very top, and you follow that Select menu downwards towards this little option right here called Inverse, and that flips the selection inside out when you do that. Now this Select menu we haven't looked at in detail, but you'll notice that most of what's on here is stuff we've already looked at, such as the load selection feature, which we did on the channels, if you'll remember, as well as the Refine Edge, which we'll look at in just a moment. There are some options on here which we have not looked at, which are also not duplicates. So many of these will be addressed in upcoming lessons, but not all of them. So just be aware that there are some elements on here which will not be covered, but for the most part, we'll get to all these at some point, but not in this lesson here. We're going to invert that. So once we've inverted the selection, you'll notice now the marching ants are surrounding everything related to our subject. So our desk, our flowers, and the woman herself. And you can see now they're down here rather than selecting the background. So we've flipped that selection inside out. It's a cute little trick that you can use when it suits you. All right, so what we're going to do now is talk about the Refine Edge option. When we choose Refine Edge, you'll notice in my case it changed the view right away. This may or may not be the case when you click on it. You have several different options under View. The default is marching ants, and this is basically no different than what we just saw when we made our selection. But as we go through the list, we'll talk about some of the benefits of using these. So for example, Overlay emulates the look you get when you use the Quick Mask tool, which we've already used in other lessons. So you'll notice you have that familiar magenta background color, but it's transparent so we can see through it. So by default, it's 50% opaque, so we can at least see through it and kind of get a sense of what's selected and what's not. And then we can use that to enhance our own modifications to that selection using different tools. Another view is to put it against solid black, which of course is 100% opaque and covers up all the detail in the back. But you'll notice for things like flowers, things that are lighter in color, you notice that that's really kind of a nice option because it enables us to see exactly how much of the flowers got selected very easily because our eyes really respond to contrast. Similarly, we have the white background option for darker areas. So for her hair, that's ideal because we can really see again the strands of hair that may or may not have been selected. Black and white reduces everything to what would be the result of an alpha channel or a saved selection, so that we can really get an up-close detailed look at the selection area as opposed to being confused by the detail of the photo. You notice now all we have is solid white and black and the gray transition areas that would define the selection that we're making, and especially the subtleties of the hair, which is what we're going to get to next in terms of trying to get some help from this tool to select difficult selection areas like hair or fur or grass or even semi-transparent areas like these petals on the flowers. Now on layers, this is another option that we will utilize because on layers allows us to see the effect of the layers themselves. In other words, if I move this out of the way, you can see that our background layer is a gradient transition from blue to white. And when I choose this view option, it enables me to see what a composite would look like based upon the selection that we've got so far. So it enables me to sort of see that stacking with the selection and an alpha channel already applied to this, or a layer mask already applied to this. We'll talk about layer mask later, but let's keep going to the last option. Reveal layer just shows the layer as it is, the top layer, with all its detail without the marching ants. So these are the view options we have. Let's go back to the on layers option, the second to the bottom. Let's click off of this so we get rid of that pop-up menu. Now we're going to talk about the different things that we can do to modify an existing selection. We'll try and cover everything on this list. I'm going to start here in the middle with the adjust edge just to kind of get this out of the way so you can see it better. I'm going to zoom in a little bit. I'm using the Command plus symbol on my keyboard. It's a keyboard shortcut to do that, or you could utilize this magnification tool here built into the menu. Remember, the space bar is a shortcut for the hand, or you can use the hand tool as well to pan around. It's really up to you. Like a lot of things in Photoshop, there's more than one way to do the same thing. So in this case, we're seeing the strands of hair that would be selected or not selected in the group as it is so far. We'll get back to the hair in just a moment, but what I want to do is talk about these more basic controls, these more kind of generalized controls under the adjust edge subcategory. So first things first, let's take a look at smooth. I'm going to come down here to where the selection's kind of jagged on her sweater, and you can see when I crank up the smooth option, see what happens? You see how that detail just disappears and it kind of smooths it out? It becomes much more vague, essentially, and so that might be useful in certain selections depending upon what you're doing. We can also take a look at this with the black and white viewpoint to kind of see what's happening there as I adjust the smooth, and you can see the detail really disappears quickly when I smooth it out to the point where it becomes so vague that it just becomes a blur. So it's kind of like a Gaussian blur almost. All right, the feather option, we've talked about feathering already, but as you'll recall, feathering softens the transition between what is selected and what's not. So it creates a gradient transition from black to white, which again blurs it, and this is actually much closer to the Gaussian blur look, but in terms of just softening that transition zone so it's not so sharp, a feather can do that, but it does it in a different way. Smooth is doing it strictly in terms of the vertical or horizontal lines that the selection is following. So you'll notice that it's not adding gray area. In the area where you do have gray, that gray already existed. So if I go out of it, you see this gray vague transition area was already there. But in areas where it's solid black and white, it stays solid black and white. It does not become a feathered area like this does, where you have that transition zone. Contrast does the opposite. It starts to alias things, and we talked about the difference between aliasing and anti-aliasing. Well, if you look at this, you'll recognize that this right away is definitely an aliased look. It takes all that softened anti-aliasing around the edges that we're used to like this, and it just turns it into a threshold of black and white where it goes either black or it goes white. There's no in between. There's no gray areas at all. So let's think of it almost as a sharpening device. Shift edge simply moves the edge inward or outward based upon going right or left. So if I go right, it's going to increase the value and it's going to push that selection area outward. If I go to the left of 0, it's going to push it inward. And here you can maybe see this better as I go. And you see how it's just, if I do an extreme, it's really shifting it out or in, depending upon my value. Now, if I want to neutralize this and not shift it, I have to go to 0, not to the left like the others. The others, 0 coincides with the left. On this slider, it coincides with the very middle, so it's easier just to type in that number 0. That's it for the adjust edge. These are your basic selection attributes that you can modify. Now we're going to go in and talk a little bit about some of the special features with the refine edge that you really can't do with any of the other tools in quite the same way. So we talked a little bit about the hair, and I didn't really mention how difficult it is to select hair, but of course you can imagine something with this much detail and this much translucency to it. There's a lot of problem areas that are difficult for a standard selection tool like a lasso or a marquee tool or even a quick selection tool to handle. So we're probably never going to get a perfect selection without the benefit of refining the edge a bit. Even with the refined edge, I hesitate to say it's perfect, but at least it's a lot closer, I think, in terms of detail, the amount of detail we can capture with our selections in these difficult areas like this. So let's start to take a look at what we can do here with the radius and the smart radius tools. So first of all, I'm going to choose show radius. What am I doing here? Well, I'm telling Photoshop to show me the area that it is going to analyze when doing a smart edge detection. And so in doing so, I can see that Photoshop, I'm going to turn this off, smart radius, will show me the boundary of the selection with an extension going outward from the selection and going inward. So you can see it's widening based upon the radius value here. So the smaller this is, the tighter and thinner this line or this area gets. Think of it as like kind of a buffer zone. But what I'm doing with this area is I'm telling Photoshop I want it to analyze these areas or this part of the selection, this part of my image, so that it can start to figure out, okay, what should be included in the selection and what should be thrown away. And this is where it's going to start using algorithms to try and figure out what is part of her or the flowers or the table and what is part of the background. And so it's going to use its own methodology to figure that out for you. And sometimes it does a great job, sometimes it struggles. It's up to us to try and choose the best options to get it closer. So what does the smart radius checkbox do? You notice when I uncheck that everything got real even. That's because it's just kind of a general manually controlled width that I select, the value of which I select here. But when I choose smart radius, what happens is Photoshop goes in and it says, well, I can recognize that in the hair area there's a lot of problem spots that I need to address. So I'm going to widen it there versus maybe like the table or the edge for sweater, which might be a little bit easier to figure out. So the more I increase the radius, you notice you start to see more and more difference between those areas where it gets fatter in the difficult parts of the flower and her hair, and it stays thinner down in the easier areas to figure out. This is because we don't want to make this area any larger than it needs to be, because we want to make sure that Photoshop is not trying to analyze the whole image where it's going to make more mistakes. We're trying to eliminate mistakes by refining this edge to its smallest value. So how do we do that? First of all, I'm still in black and white mode, so that might not be the best way to figure this out. I might want to switch to something where I can see the image. And let me zoom in because I'm really kind of small here. I'm going to click off of this and zoom in. Let's focus on our hair since that seems to be the main topic here. Now you can see better, I think, what's going on. What I'm controlling here is related to the amount of hair that's frizzy out here. And you can see these kind of strands of hair. I'm starting to include more and more of those based upon this value. So again, this is a personal choice. It's letting you decide how much of this you want to include or exclude. And that really is up to you. Maybe you don't want every strand of hair, or maybe for you, it's a very important thing. So it's really letting you kind of take a role in this. Now, this is not all you can do. You can actually come in and take it even further by using the paintbrush tool. So I'm going to come in. Now, I call it the paintbrush tool because everything looks like a paintbrush. I pretty much say that, but it's actually the Refine Edge tool. And you can click on this and see the contextual menu here. So let me just hold it here for a second. And there we go. So there's the Refine Radius tool, and then the Erase Refinements tool. So this is basically the opposite of this. So let's show you what I mean. I'm going to come in, and I'm going to start painting on this area. And you can see I can just sort of custom paint how much of the hair I wanted to analyze, how important it is I think it looks at this stuff. And as I do that, you can start to see Photoshop starts already working its magic and bringing more of this into the selection. And you can start to see hair is coming back as I paint with it, little by little. So assuming that I was trying to preserve as much of this as I could, I might have much better results by painting it by hand. Now, if I go too far and I start to paint inwards like this, I'm giving it too much to look at. That's not good. It's probably going to start to think cutting information away. I can use the other tool, which is the Erase Refinements tool, which will come in and say, okay, I don't need Photoshop to analyze that. We know that's part of the selection and we're good with it. It's only the buffer areas where we start to see some of the background popping through the hair. That's where we want it to look at. All right, so you get the idea. You know, I could keep going with this, and I can keep refining the edge with the Refine Edge tool and including more of this on this side. So, oops, I got the wrong tool. Let's try this again. There we go. So just starting to bring some of that hair back into the mold. All right, here we go. So now, the same thing is true with areas that I don't think are problematic, like the selection area around her sweater. I can come in and just tighten this up if I want to, but I'm just going to leave it as is for that. I'm just going to focus on the hair. So with that selected, we can now just switch our view and see what this would look like. I'm going to go ahead and turn the show radius off and zoom in a bit. Just take a look at what Photoshop is doing with the selection. So you can see it's cutting in here quite a bit, but just because I don't have the show radius checked doesn't mean I can't still use this tool. I can come in here and I can still erase these areas. Like, I don't really want this to bleed into her head this much, so I'm going to take that out. So I'm just making this go away and saying, all right, this part, I want it to be more solid. All right. All right, and it's having some issues with that. I can tighten this up a bit maybe and see if that backs off a little bit. Again, is this going to be a perfect tool? No, it's not totally perfect. It's much better than it has been in the past with the extract tool that Photoshop used to have. But it's a difficult algorithm to solve. It's difficult to teach software what exactly we want to keep and what we don't. It's getting better, but there are still issues with it, but I can still kind of fine-tune it and touch it up as best I can. And you can see it's doing a pretty good job considering how difficult it is to figure out something like this. Now here I can see it's a bit gray. The gradient's not coming through. Maybe I'm not real happy with that, so I could again use this tool to sort of tell it to look at that area. Now it's bringing some of it in. And at any given time, I can go to the black and white and see what's been done. So you can see it added those areas that I painted. Those are some gray in there to bring in some of the transparency that would show through into the background. But if you look at this, you can see there's quite a lot of detail around the hair. It's done a pretty good job, I think, everywhere in terms of figuring out and isolating areas. And if we accept this, we can click OK, and then it's going to go ahead and I'm going to jump back to the on layers option again. We're going to skip through the adjust edge because I'm quite happy with what it's selecting, but down here we have to make some more decisions in terms of the output. So we have decontaminate colors, and then we can turn that on or off, and you can see the difference. Mine was already on, yours may have not been, but if you turn yours on, you should see an improvement in the way it selects that hair. You see that, you notice how much hair popped back with that turned on as opposed to with it turned off. It's able to differentiate those color areas better. All right, now the amount in which I choose to do that is adjustable. So if I crank this way up, I'm going to get more hair back, whereas if I take this down, it's going to be a lot more conservative. So again, you may not be seeing a difference if you don't slide this to the right. So I'm going to go quite a ways up there to the right. The final choice is, how do you want to output this new selection that you've adjusted? So now you've modified the existing selection and you're ready to do something with it. You have to choose one of these options. So you can choose to make it a new layer with a layer mask. You can make it a new document or a new document with a layer mask. So layer masks are a very big topic in Photoshop. We're going to be using them a lot in this semester, and we'll be coming back to this topic again and again. There's an entire video dedicated to layer masks, and so just wait for it. We're not going to get to it right now. I will just mention a little bit about what layer masks do, but it's really just kind of a preview towards that next tutorial. When we get into that, it will be coming up shortly. Now, new document and new layer, what this will do is it will just create a new layer or a new document without the layer mask. I'm going to choose with a layer mask because that's a less destructive way to work, and I want to keep it that way. So let's choose new layer with layer mask. All right, I'm going to click OK to accept that. And this is what it creates. You'll notice it automatically deactivated the visibility of the woman layer, but it duplicated that layer completely and made what we call a layer mask. A layer mask is this black and white graphic next to it. Let me make this full screen so you can see it. Does that look familiar? It should, because that is the same graphic we just saw when we were previewing this in the Refine Edge area. So it applied this black and white graphic, which creates transparency on this layer. So the black areas are the transparent areas, which we'll see through to the gradient. So I'm going to make this visible again. And so yeah, basically now I can see the gradient transition. I can see what it's selected and what it's isolated in her hair. But why use a layer mask? Why is this less destructive? Well, I'm going to show you. So with a layer mask, and again, we'll get to this later in other tutorials, but just real quickly, if I select this layer mask and I zoom in, remember that problem area that I had with her hair? I wasn't quite happy with what it was doing. It never did a great job in my opinion. I can come in with my paintbrushes and I can start fixing that with the layer mask without destroying or altering any of the original pixels. So that's the beauty of it. Again, with layer mask, we paint with black or white, and we paint according towards what we need. So I want white because I want to paint back some of her hair. And I'm just going to do this, and I can see, well, there's a little bit of that original area that got lost. If I go too far and I reveal too much, and it's too pixelated, I can go in and I can go ahead and just paint this back. So I'm painting with black to put things back. I'm painting with white to reveal it. I can also blur a layer mask. I can make a selection and Gaussian blur it to create a feather. So there's a lot of things you can do to layer mask to adjust them, and we'll get to that later in other lessons. But for now, we'll just leave this as is. But this is a look at the Refine Edge tool. Hopefully you've got a sense of the power it has and what it can do to help you make selections. And hopefully you're starting to get an idea of where it can help you in terms of adjusting the selections you make with the basic selection tool. And once again, we will talk more about many of the tools into the select menu on future lessons. So what you're going to do is you're going to go ahead after you've done with the Refine Edge tool, make those adjustments that I've shown you. You're going to save this file and turn it in with these 3 layers. And just make sure that your layer mask is intact and your background and everything. And just leave the visibility on the top layer. So just go ahead and save it with that the same name, and you'll be ready to turn that in. We'll see you on the next lesson.